With so many options, why choose Arizona State University?
For me, the only online option was ASU because of the quality. Their faculty was really involved with their students and care about your personal journey. The dedication to my personal development from my professors, that's been extremely valuable to me.
Earn your degree from the nation's most innovative university. Online. That's a degree better. Explore more than 350 plus undergraduate, graduate, and certificate programs at asuonline.asu.edu.
This message comes from Capital One. The Capital One Venture X business card has no preset spending limit, so the card's purchasing power can adapt to meet business needs. Plus, the card earns unlimited double miles on every purchase, so the more a business spends, the more miles earned. And when traveling, the Venture X business card grants access to over 1,000 airport lounges. The Venture X business card. What's in your wallet? Terms and conditions apply. Find out more at CapitalOne.com/VentureXBusiness.
Let's take a minute and talk about courage. Courage, the ability to stand fast in the face of adversity. Courage, to act bravely with determination and clarity of purpose, to have the fortitude to defend what you believe is right. Courage, to be unmoved by fear. What makes a muskrat guard his musk? Courage. Courage is perhaps one of the most universal human virtues. The great American poet Maya Angelou once famously wrote that, quote, "Courage is the most important of the virtues, because without courage, you can't practice any other virtue consistently. You can practice any virtue erratically, but nothing consistently without courage." End quote. Maya Angelou's wisdom seems to echo the sentiments of countless thinkers throughout human history and across cultures. The ancient Greek philosophers Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle had much to say about courage as one of the most important qualities to be nurtured in the soul. Plato argued that courage needed to be harnessed by reason to tame the beasts of appetite and desire that we all contend with. In India, one of the most beloved sections of the epic poem known as the Mahabharata is the advice of the god on earth Krishna to the great warrior Prince Arjuna as he hesitates on the field of battle. This text, known as the Bhagavad Gita, proposes that a philosophical perspective, a macrocosmic lens, and religious devotion are key to acting courageously. In China, the philosopher Confucius is credited with saying that courage is best when paired with a deep sense of justice. The saying goes, quote, "If an inferior man has courage but neglects justice, he becomes a thief." End quote. The Tao Te Ching, on the other hand, suggests that courage is deeply connected to love and compassion, telling us that, quote, "From caring comes courage." End quote. As much as courage is universally agreed to be one of the most admired human qualities, every culture has a slightly different spin on how courage should manifest. Many cultures value acts of heroism and dash. For instance, many indigenous groups from the North American Plains region observe the tradition of counting coup, which involves noting acts of bravery in battle. Interestingly, some of the most celebrated acts in those cultures involve getting close to your enemy, physically touching them, but not necessarily harming them, and then escaping unharmed yourself. The goal is to demonstrate that the warrior is unafraid, and that victory over fear comes with more prestige than any specific harm done to a foe. This is courage mixed with a healthy dose of daring. Conversely, you have the French notion of sang-froid, or cold blood, which suggests a type of courage detached from emotion. Then you have the very English concept of pluck, or being plucky. Pluck is a combination of unflappability, determination, and a type of cheerfulness in the face of adversity. Now, when I say cheerful, I don't mean giddy or gleeful. I mean pleasantly going about your business unbothered. It's the stiff upper lip, but with just a dash of fun. Pluck is defiantly keeping your sense of humor and not letting your enemies put you off your breakfast. In the 19th century, being plucky easily meshed with Victorian ideas of fair play and being a good sport. Taking a setback or even a loss with grace was considered admirably plucky. During the World Wars, the cult of pluck grew to new and unprecedented levels. In fact, during the Second World War, many of the British propaganda images depicting civilians leaned into the idea that the British could not be defeated because of their innate pluck. During the Blitz, photographs of the destruction wrought by German bombs were tightly censored by a government trying to maintain morale. However, one image of the Blitz that was approved was a now iconic image of a London milkman carefully stepping his way over debris in the street while firefighters actively fought a blaze behind him. The subtle smile on the milkman's face and the determination to finish his deliveries was the perfect embodiment of English pluck. We now know that photograph was staged. The photographer Frank Morley came upon the blasted-out street, saw the firefighters working, and knew that this was the perfect setting for a potentially memorable image. So he had his assistant quickly run out, cobble together a milkman's uniform, and buy a crate full of glass bottles of milk. The assistant was then told to get into costume, pose, and look unfussed. The image has endured because it purported to be a spotting of pluck in the wild. It was how the British wanted to see themselves, or perhaps needed to see themselves during the dark days of 1940. But of course, Frank Morley knew that image would be a winner because he understood just how far back into England's history the cult of pluck extended. This was an ancient virtue, an aspect of the culture of the island going back centuries. For instance, take the tale of Sir Francis Drake, Queen Elizabeth's best-loved pirate, and his game of bowls on Plymouth Hoe. The story goes that it was Friday, July 29th, 1588, and England was bracing for the arrival of the dreaded Spanish Armada. The Vice Admiral of the English fleet was the notorious seaborne robber and the second commander to circumnavigate the globe, Sir Francis Drake. The fleet set to defend the kingdom was at anchor in Plymouth Harbor, waiting to be called into action as soon as the Spanish were spotted. To pass the time, Drake and some companions headed up to the Plymouth Hoe, an open grassy space above Plymouth's limestone cliffs, to play a relaxing game of bowls. Now, if you're not familiar with bowls, it's basically lawn bowling. The Italians have bocce, the French have pétanque, the English have bowls. There are regional rule variations, but it's all pretty similar. It's about as chill a backyard game as you can play. But just then, a breathless messenger ran up the hoe with urgent news. The Spanish Armada had been spotted by a scout ship just off the Scilly Isles, near Cornwall. The enemy were now dangerously close to England. What would the order be? Sir Francis Drake was unbothered. He looked around and decided that he should probably finish his game before rousing the fleet. He allegedly said, quote, "Time enough to play the game and thrash the Spaniards afterwards," end quote. And so, that son of a gun finished playing bowls before he set about mobilizing the fleet. Ladies and gentlemen, that is what we call plucky. Now, of course, there are many reasons to believe that this story probably is not true. First, It doesn't appear in any sources contemporary to 1588. It first gets reported in a source written some 40 years after the fact. Now, that's not disqualifying on its own, but remember, the later a story appears in the sources, the more skeptical we should be. The story becomes a little more suspicious when you consider that Francis Drake was the vice admiral of the English fleet. News about the sighting of the Armada would have more properly been delivered directly to the Lord High Admiral. That was a guy named Charles Howard of Effingham. The High Admiral would have been the person who made the call about when the fleet put to sea, not Francis Drake. It's also been guessed that the English fleet was not immediately mobilized because the sailing conditions would have made it impossible for such a large group of ships to effectively leave harbor. The combination of an unfavorable tide and a stiff southwest breeze made it a particularly bad time to put to sea. It's possible that Drake was informed about the spotting of the Armada, but a quick assessment of the tide and the wind told the experienced sailor that the fleet wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. His boss, the Lord High Admiral, certainly would not give the order to muster until conditions changed. So, why not finish the game? But again, that's just a guess. The story of Francis Drake finishing his game of bowls has persisted because it seems to epitomize English pluck. Pluck sometimes gets compared to the American concept of grit. But grit suggests a no-nonsense type of determination, whereas pluck is an all-nonsense type of determination. Someone with grit has no time for games. Someone with pluck refuses to let a crisis put them off their games. Being plucky is also about confidence in an underdog's chance. You see, the English engagement with the Spanish Armada has been mythologized as a David and Goliath type struggle. The Spanish fleet was, after all, the largest collection of ships ever assembled on the Atlantic to that point in history. The Spanish Empire was at the apex of its power. The Habsburg King of Spain, Phillip II, ruled the entire Iberian Peninsula, the European Low Countries, the Philippines, and a smattering of colonies in Africa and India. He also marshaled the wealth looted from the vanquished empires of North and South America. In all seriousness, he claimed title to nearly half the planet. The English, by contrast, were upstarts, a rising European power just starting to sniff what would later be seen as its imperial destiny. It was a hotbed of pirates and adventurers, a place of irrepressible pluck, or so goes the tale. The fact that the Spanish Armada was ultimately unsuccessful in launching an invasion of England has been remembered as one of the greatest English naval triumphs of the early modern period. The fact that these underdogs managed to thwart the designs of Europe's most formidable empire seemed to presage Britain's many future triumphs. In hindsight, the Spanish Armada could be seen as just the first of many seemingly invincible foes who were unable to take the island from her stubborn countrymen. Whether it was Napoleon, Kaiser Wilhelm II, or Adolf Hitler, their designs on Britain were always stymied by undaunted British pluck. But is this perception of the Spanish Armada really consistent with the facts? Was this truly a David versus Goliath scenario, or has that been exaggerated? How much did the English fleet even do to stop the Armada? Was this really the world-changing event that it's sometimes remembered as? Or has a mid-tier early modern naval encounter been blown way out of proportion? Let's see what we can figure out today on Our Fake History. Episode number 198. Was the Spanish Armada a big deal? Part 1. Hello and welcome to Our Fake History. My name is Sebastian Major, and this is the podcast where we explore historical myths and try to determine what's fact, what's fiction, and what is such a good story that it simply must be told. Before we get going this week, I just want to remind everyone that an ad-free version of this podcast is available through Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/ourfakehistory and check out the level of support that works for you. You can support this show for as little as $1 a month. But if you want access to the ad-free feed and all the awesome extras available, then please start supporting at $5 or more. I also want to remind everyone that we're still taking calls and voice messages to be featured in our 200th episode Call-In Spectacular. If you want to be part of that show, then either make a voice recording and then email it to me at ourfakehistory@gmail.com, or if that feels too complicated, then you can always call in to our toll-free number at 1-800-397-0870. Since we last spoke, I've been getting all sorts of messages. We got tons now, but don't let that discourage you. If you've got a pressing question that you've wanted to ask me for a long time and you like the idea of hearing your voice on the show, then please call in. Now, I will remind everyone once again that the voice memos provide considerably better sound quality than the 1-800 number messages. So if you can do a voice memo, then I recommend it. But, of course, I will not discriminate against the old-fashioned callers. So once again, it's 1-800-397-0870. This week, we are kicking off a new series focused on the year 1588 and the ill-fated Habsburg fleet that has been remembered in English simply as the Spanish Armada. Known in Spanish, somewhat ironically, as La Felicima Armada, or the Most Fortunate Fleet, this massive naval force was, in the late 16th century, one of the largest collections of ships ever put to sea. While the details of the officially undeclared Anglo-Spanish War that spanned from 1585 to 1604 have faded from popular memory, the Spanish Armada has retained a certain level of historical name recognition. Now, that's not just some historical fluke. The demise of the Spanish Armada has been celebrated as one of the most important moments in English history. This is largely the result of potent 16th century propaganda providing grist for the mill of celebratory English history writing, especially in the Victorian and post-war eras. Now, to be clear, it's indisputable that the Spanish had planned to invade England and were unable to do it. That fact alone made for a massive propaganda victory for England's reigning monarch. This was, of course, the famous Queen Elizabeth I. The episode went down as one of Queen Elizabeth's most memorable triumphs. In fact, the much-debated Elizabethan Golden Age is sometimes said to have started with the defeat of the Spanish Armada. Elizabeth's best-known speech, her address at Tilbury on the eve of the conflict with the Armada, has been immortalized as one of the definitive pieces of English political rhetoric from the early modern period. Elizabethan painters and poets celebrated the stymieing of the Spanish Armada in the most dramatic and romantic ways possible. This was all employed in Queen Elizabeth's growing cult of personality, as Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, heaven blessed to rule an unconquerable realm. This perception of the event, promoted by Elizabeth and her supporters, eventually made its way into English language histories. By the 19th century, at the height of the British Empire, British historians had started to see the Spanish Armada as one of world history's most significant turning points. In 1888, as England celebrated the tercentenary of the Armada's failed invasion, many Britons felt confident that 1588 had actually been a fulcrum of history. The official program of the tercentenary celebrations declared that the clash with the Armada had been, quote, an event of supreme importance to the whole civilized world, end quote. In that year, the historian W.H.K. Wright toured Britain with a lecture titled Britain's Salamis, or The Glorious Fight of 1588. As the name suggests, Wright compared the clash with the Spanish Armada to one of the most famous naval battles of antiquity. The Battle of Salamis was the celebrated victory of the outnumbered Athenian navy over the invading Persians in 1580. Salamis is often credited with turning the tide in the Greco-Persian Wars. For Wright, the Spanish easily fit the Persian stereotype of being decadent and arrogant, whereas the English were the, allegedly, freedom-loving Greeks. On top of making this bold historical comparison, Wright declared that the fight of 1588 had, quote, more important and far-reaching consequences on the destinies of nations than any other since the Norman conquest, end quote. Not only was Wright arguing that this event shaped the destinies of all the world's nations, but also that the freedoms so valued by the Victorians were at stake when the Armada arrived in the English Channel. He declared, quote, we now enjoy the liberties and privileges which were threatened by Phillip II in 1588. We are indebted to the pluck and dauntless courage of the men who bore the brunt of this struggle, end quote. This narrative did not die with the Victorians. With the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II in 1953, there came a renewed interest in the alleged golden age of the First Elizabeth. Some enthusiastic monarchists in 1950s Britain even started referring to themselves as the New Elizabethans. The New Elizabethans tended to accept fairly uncritically that the reign of the First Elizabeth had indeed been a golden age and had set the stage for all of Britain's future glories. This only served to reinflate the already bloated reputation of England's battle with the Spanish Armada. For instance, in 1955, the military historian and former British Major General J.F.C. Fuller listed the defeat of the Spanish Armada as one of the 15 decisive battles of the Western world, in his book of the same name. In those pages, he summed up the significance of the event like this, quote, the historical importance of the defeat of the Armada is this. It laid the cornerstone of the British Empire by endowing England with the prestige Spain had lost. And it was this prestige, this faith in her destiny, that urged the English along the imperial way until their flag floated over the greatest empire the world has so far seen, end quote. In this appraisal, the Spanish Armada marked both the start of England's ascent as a global superpower and Spain's decline. This clash changed the hierarchy of power in Europe and, by extension, the world. Or so goes the classic take. But by the time the 400th anniversary of the Armada rolled around, the scholarly opinion of this event had changed significantly. Many experts were no longer convinced that the traditional conception of the Spanish Armada was supported by the historical facts. Most prominent among them was Phillip Fernandez Armesto, a British history professor who happens to be half Spanish. He argued that the importance of the naval encounter between England and Spain in 1588 had been grossly exaggerated by a patriotic historical tradition. But a shift in the academic understanding of the event is quite different from a shift in the popular understanding of the event. As we know, historical myths, especially patriotic historical myths, tend to die hard. The historian Garrett Mattingly admitted in the 1983 edition of his book, The Defeat of the Spanish Armada, quote, the legend of the Armada became as important as the event itself, perhaps even more important, end quote. So let's take a good look at what led up to the events of 1588. Why did the Spanish king feel compelled to launch an invasion of England? How much was really at stake? Was this really the fulcrum of history touted by the Victorians and New Elizabethans? To properly answer those questions, we're going to need some serious historical context. So, buckle up. We're going deep into the twists and turns of the 16th century. In the poem, A Ballad to Queen Elizabeth of the Spanish Armada, the Victorian poet Henry Austin Dobson sums up the cause of hostilities between Spain and England like this, quote, King Phillip had vaunted his claims. He had sworn for a year that he would sack us with an army of heathenish names, end quote. Later in the poem, he would continue, quote, At sea he can hope to outthwack us. To his mines of Peru he would pack us, end quote. In this very English and very mythic retelling of the events of 1588, the King of Spain is cast as an arch-villain. He's a bloodthirsty tyrant whose goal is to sack England and enslave her people. In this telling, Philip raises the Armada for no other reason than to subjugate a country over which he has a flimsy claim and condemn her citizenry to a life of toiling in the silver mines of Peru. In this poem, the king is a megalomaniac leading a quote-unquote heathenish army in an unprovoked attack on an island of free people. Nothing quite sells a historical myth like a patriotic ballad. As you might expect, the road to war was considerably more twisty than Dobson's poem suggests. It's worth questioning just how apocalyptic the Spanish war aims truly were. How did we get to the point where King Philip II felt like he needed to build the largest fleet on the Atlantic to attempt an invasion of England? Well, to understand that, I think we need to get a sense of Anglo-Spanish relations going back at least a few decades. Early in the 16th century, Spain and England had enjoyed a very close relationship, cemented by one of the more shrewdly arranged marriages of the era. Way back in 1499, Henry VII, the founder of England's Tudor dynasty, married his son and heir Arthur to the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, Catherine of Aragon. Not only did this marriage help reinforce the legitimacy of the still shaky Tudor dynasty, but it allied England to Ferdinand and Isabella's Spain. This was the 1490s after all. Our old pal Columbus had just recently planted the Spanish flag in the Caribbean. Soon, the Spanish crown would find itself flush with gold plundered from the Americas, and the kingdom would start asserting itself as the foremost of Europe's great powers. From the English perspective, Spain was such a good ally to have in the early 1500s that the premature death of Arthur at the age of 15 didn't stop Henry VII from preserving that marriage alliance, even if now it was a little awkward. The new plan was to marry Catherine of Aragon to Arthur's younger brother, the new heir apparent, Henry. That is, the future King Henry VIII. This marriage required a special dispensation from the Pope because it was technically against canon law for a man to marry his brother's widow. But the Pope obliged, the marriage happened, and Catherine became the first of Henry VIII's many wives. At the time, preserving the Anglo-Spanish alliance was worth calling in a favor from the Pope for. But the marriage of Catherine and Henry was one of the most famously doomed matches in English history, and the dissolution of that marriage would have huge consequences, both politically and spiritually, for England. To make a long and very complicated story short, by 1525, Henry was frustrated that Catherine had not borne him a male heir. He had also become infatuated with a lady-in-waiting named Anne Boleyn. So he embarked on a long process of trying to have his marriage annulled by the Pope. When his many requests were denied, in 1534, Henry broke with the Roman Catholic Church and issued the Act of Supremacy, which made him, the king, the head of the newly independent Church of England. Now, I'm sure some of you are thinking, why have you taken us back this far for a crash course in King Henry VIII? Well, the question of England's religious character was hugely important to the events of 1588. By breaking with the Pope, Henry VIII had loosely aligned himself with the still fairly new Protestant movements coming out of the Reformation. Now, I'm going to assume that we all have a basic understanding of who the early Protestants were, because if I try and squeeze a whole explanation of the Reformation in here, this podcast will collapse. Suffice it to say that the movement started by the monk Martin Luther, criticizing the excesses of the church, had given birth to dozens of new flavors of Christianity that were spreading quickly. These new denominations were broadly known as Protestant. In 1534, Henry VIII invented his own flavor of Protestant, the Anglicans. Despite Henry's big break with Rome, the Church of England remained noticeably Catholic-influenced when it came to religious doctrine and ceremonial style. One of the most pressing and violent debates in England for the next century and a half would concern just how Protestant the Church of England should be. You might remember from our Salem witch trial series that the so-called Puritans were English Protestants who thought that the Church of England should be more in line with the teachings of the Protestant reformer John Calvin. To them, Calvinism meant purity. This debate would eventually be at the heart of the civil wars that would eventually consume England in the mid-1600s. But of course, we're not there yet. When Henry VIII died, 13 years and 5 wives after his break with Rome, he was succeeded by his 9-year-old son, Edward, who only reigned for 6 years before his untimely death. He in turn was succeeded by his half-sister, Queen Mary I. Mary was the daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, and given her mother's devoted Catholicism, she had been raised to be very Roman Catholic. And now we're getting to it. You see, Mary I was intent on turning back the clock on English Protestantism, sometimes violently. To that end, she sought to realign England with Europe's most significant Roman Catholic power, Spain. She was the granddaughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, after all. So Mary arranged a marriage to the future builder of the Spanish Armada, the heir to the throne of Spain, her first cousin once removed, Phillip. So, I think it's kind of interesting that from 1554 to 1558, while Philip II was married to Queen Mary I, he was technically styled as the King of England. Now, to be clear, Mary was the monarch and Philip was just the royal consort. But I think this whole episode makes a bit more sense when you consider that at one time Philip II had been called the King of England. So in 1588, when he was building the Spanish Armada, his interest in English affairs wasn't really a new thing. But the pendulum of English politics and religion would swing again in 1558 when Queen Mary died without an heir. This paved the way for the ascension of Mary's half-sister, Elizabeth. Elizabeth was the daughter of Anne Boleyn and had been raised more Protestant than her older half-sister. As such, Elizabeth was supported by a hardcore of Protestant English nobles, happy to put the days of the Catholic queen that they called Bloody Mary behind them. The ascension of Elizabeth meant that England was once again swinging Protestant. With all that in mind, it can be easy to see the Spanish Armada and the attempted invasion of England in 1588 through a religious lens. These were the European wars of religion playing out at sea, with the question of England's religious character hanging in the balance. Indeed, both Philip II and Queen Elizabeth would position themselves as champions of their respective religious causes. Philip quite consciously presented himself as the most Catholic of the Roman Catholic monarchs and a defender of the true faith. Elizabeth was a little more hesitant to present herself as the champion of all Protestant Europe, but once the battle was imminent, she embraced that role, understanding its potent rhetorical power. But we're getting a little ahead of ourselves here. You see, when Elizabeth became the Queen of England, a conflict with Spain or any other Catholic power was certainly not a foregone conclusion. While Elizabeth was understood to be Protestant and was supported by powerful English Protestant nobles, she was hardly a religious ideologue. In the early years of her reign, there was a certain amount of toleration for English Catholics, although this would change as her reign progressed. Still, it's worth noting that Philip II had originally supported Elizabeth's ascension to the throne, despite her well-known religious affinities. In 1559, Philip even proposed marriage to Elizabeth. At least at that point, a Protestant England still seemed like a reasonable ally, and a Protestant English woman seemed like a reasonable wife, so long as she converted. Also, I think we need to be careful not to get too carried away with the fact that Philip had once been called the King of England. When you learn that, it's easy to go, oh, I get it. This guy used to be the King of England, and he wanted to be King of England again. Easy peasy. The first line of Henry Austin Dobson's poem is, quote, King Philip had vaunted his claims, end quote. That leans into the idea that Philip was just dying to wear the crown of England again. Now, it is true that Philip was always keen to press his claims. But many historians have pointed out that the Spanish Armada and the attempted invasion of England had a lot less to do with England than you might expect. The other key piece of the puzzle here is the situation that had been unfolding in the Netherlands. Allow me to break this down. Now, we've been talking quite a lot about Philip II without really explaining who he was. Philip was the son of one of the most powerful European monarchs of the early modern period. That was the Habsburg Charles V, the man who inherited half the world. Okay, well, that's an exaggeration, but only a little bit. In the course of his life, Charles held the titles Archduke of Austria, Lord of the Netherlands, King of Spain, and Holy Roman Emperor. as the King of Spain, he controlled the largest European colonial empire of the day and claimed most of North and South America. As Holy Roman Emperor, he exercised a loose authority over most of German-speaking Europe. And as the leading Habsburg, he held a personal title to a diverse collection of lands all over the European continent. When he abdicated, Charles V split his massive holdings between two main inheritors. His brother, Ferdinand, became the Holy Roman Emperor and took the Austrian part of the empire. His son, Philip, became the King of Spain and took over its vast colonial holdings. So Philip inherited the richest part of Europe's richest empire. To give you a sense of just how world-spanning Philip's holdings truly were, the Philippines were literally named after him. It's safe to say that being the royal consort of England was of secondary importance. Now, in that inheritance, Philip, and by extension the crown of Spain, was given dominion over the part of northwest Europe known as the Low Countries, which are today the nations of Belgium and the Netherlands. Okay, so the start of the event, sometimes called the Dutch Revolt, and sometimes called the 80 Years' War, is a very complicated and messy thing that divides historians and could sink a podcast already heavy with 16th century political context. But to understand the Spanish Armada, it's important at least to understand the broad strokes of this conflict. So here's what you need to know. In the 16th century, Habsburg rule of the Netherlands was a contentious thing. The Emperor Charles V, who was himself Flemish, hailing from the now Belgian city of Ghent, wanted to keep that region Roman Catholic. Lutheranism and Calvinism, along with other brands of Protestant religion, were gaining popularity there. So both Charles and his heir, Philip II, adopted harsh anti-heresy policies in hopes of stamping out Protestantism in the region. These inflexible religious policies, paired with unpopular taxes and moves to centralize authority in the region, led first to protest and then eventually to violent rebellion. Now, many historians will point out that the rebels in this conflict were drawn from many religious and linguistic backgrounds, but the core of the rebellion hardened around the Dutch Protestants. The Dutch Revolt turned violent in 1566, and the Low Countries would become one of the most bloody and unpredictable corners of Philip II's empire. As the revolt steadily transformed into a Dutch independence movement, Philip II did everything he could to squash the nascent Dutch state and keep the Netherlands in the Habsburg fold. In the run-up to 1588, it was this situation that was foremost on his mind. Philip was seeking to keep his inheritance intact, keep a populous section of Europe Catholic, and keep his father's homeland from slipping through his fingers. It's safe to say that between 1566 and 1588, the Dutch revolt had Philip's attention. So, I'm sure some of you are thinking, why then did Philip build the Atlantic's biggest ever fleet and send it on a mission to invade England? What happened there? That's a great question. But let's take a break. And when we return, we'll look at exactly why, during the tumult of the Dutch Revolt, England found itself in the Spanish crosshairs. When you're looking at European politics in the 16th century, it's impossible to ignore questions of religion. The Reformation had rocked Europe to its very core. It's hard to overstate how deeply the breakup of the Western Church affected all aspects of life in Western Europe at the time. Not only were average Christians presented with radically new interpretations of theology and styles of worship, the embrace or rejection of various strains of Protestantism redrew the political map of Europe. Previous alliances that seemed rock solid, like that between England and Spain, no longer made much sense post-Reformation. Because of this, almost every European conflict in the 16th and early 17th centuries had a religious dimension. The conflict between England and Spain certainly was no different. But as scholars like Phillip Fernandez Armesto have argued, we shouldn't let the religious overtones of the clash of 1588 lead us towards embracing historical myths. For instance, it's very easy to boil down the Anglo-Spanish War to its religious causes. As such, it's often assumed that King Philip II of Spain had almost entirely religious objectives. In an illustrated popular history of the Armada, published in 2009, the author Angus Constam really leaned into this, arguing that the Spanish Armada was the, quote, floating embodiment of the Counter-Reformation, end quote. The Counter-Reformation being the Roman Catholic reaction against the emergence of Protestant Christianity. Constam goes as far to write that the Spanish Armada's objective was, quote, nothing less than the crushing of Protestant heresy in England and the establishment of the Catholic faith throughout the British Isles, end quote. Now, in many ways, Constam is articulating a very old historical tradition about the Anglo-Spanish War, that English Protestantism itself was at stake in this fight. This contributes to the big narrative that the battle with the Spanish Armada was one of the most pivotal moments in European and world history. Constam and others can perhaps be forgiven for embracing this interpretation because both the English and the Spanish framed this conflict as a holy war in the run-up to the Armada's embarkation. This was especially true of the rhetoric used by the King of Spain and his commanders. By the 1580s, Philip II had fully embraced his role as Europe's leading Catholic monarch. While as a young man, he'd been a fairly typical Renaissance prince, interested in ancient pagan philosophy, art, and all the earthly pleasures. But he had become an increasingly pious Catholic as his reign progressed. He was even perceived as being monk-like in his austerity at times. Now, this was part image-making, but also seemed to have been grounded in a very real embrace of his religion, starting around the 1570s. As the Armada made its preparations to sail, Philip II presented the enterprise as an extension of his holy mission on earth. In keeping with that, the commander of the Armada, the Duke of Medina Sidonia, made an exhortation to his troops before the ships put to sea. In it, he claimed that the mission was about avenging the deaths of Catholics who had died as martyrs in England at the hands of King Henry VIII and his devilish bastard daughter, Queen Elizabeth I. He declared, quote, there we are called by the laments of innumerable Catholics in prison, the cries of widows who lost their husbands for faith, the weeping of virgins who were forced to yield their lives rather than destroy their souls, the tender children suckled on the poison of heresy, who are doomed to perdition unless deliverance reaches them. And all ranks of Catholics who are oppressed and downtrodden by the heretics and are looking to us for their liberation. End quote. If we were to go off that speech alone, then it would be easy to conclude that the Spanish Armada had been built for the sole purpose of liberating English Catholics and stamping out what the Catholics saw as a heresy. But this was rhetoric specifically designed to rouse the spirits of Roman Catholic soldiers and sailors. It obscures, or flatly ignores, much of the realpolitik that inspired this mission, and it grossly inflates what the Spanish war aims truly were. So, let's go back a little bit. It's worth understanding that in the decades leading up to 1588, the English had been engaged in all sorts of provocative activities that were steadily souring relations with the Spanish. First, we need to talk about the pirates. In the mid-16th century, the Spanish claimed the exclusive right to conquer, colonize, and trade in the vast majority of North and South America. Other Europeans were technically not allowed to sail to the rich Caribbean, or the Spanish Main as it had become known, unless they were given explicit permission to do so by the Spanish. Now, of course, this didn't stop Europeans from all over the continent from mounting all sorts of expeditions in defiance of these Spanish claims, but this is what the Spanish were putting out into the world. We control this chunk of the planet. Don't come here. The English sailors who pushed the boundaries of Spanish tolerance were originally slavers and other merchants looking to make money selling mostly human cargo in the Spanish colonies. The most notorious of these English slavers was a man named John Hawkins. In many ways, Hawkins represents the worst of the Atlantic slave trade. He would sail from England to West Africa, where he would sometimes trade with locals for prisoners of war, but would often simply raid coastal areas and force any African person he could find into slavery. On occasion, he even encouraged conflicts between rival groups in West Africa so they would go to war and he could collect human beings. Then he would sail to the Caribbean, where he would either bribe local governors to allow him to trade, or he would turn his guns on Spanish settlements and threaten them with a bombardment unless they paid him for the people that he had packed in his hold. Hawkins proved to be so effective at making money in this way that by his second voyage, the English crown had become one of his investors. Now, of course, the crown kept its distance. They needed to have plausible deniability if the Spanish ever decided to clap John Hawkins in irons for violating their laws. But every time he was successful, Queen Elizabeth got a cut. But Hawkins' illegal trading would seem like small fries compared to the all-out piracy committed by one of his former compatriots, an Our Fake History podcast regular, Sir Francis Drake. Drake was a well-known Plymouth captain who had cut his teeth sailing on the slaving raids of John Hawkins. But by 1571, Drake had taken command of his own vessel and set out on yearly cruises of the Spanish Main, where he was straight up robbing Spanish treasure ships. Now, on this podcast before, I've recounted some of Drake's pirate adventures. If you check out my series on the first person to sail around the world from Season 1, and my look at the hoax of Drake's plate in the episode called What is America's Weirdest Secret Society from Season 5, then you can hear my take on some of those tales. What you need to know is that Drake was a very successful pirate. He made off with huge amounts of money robbing Spanish shipping and attacking Spanish mule trains carrying silver in Central America. His daring exploits made for great stories back in England, all the more so because he consistently got away with it. In his home country, he was celebrated as a hero, but we shouldn't get it twisted. Francis Drake was a violent and often ruthless pirate. He racked up a serious body count as he robbed his way to respectability. The Spanish called him El Drac, playing on how his last name sounded like the old Castilian word for dragon. With all sensitivity to the dead, you have to admit that El Drac, the dragon, is a pretty badass pirate name. Now, in the 1570s, Drake was technically not flying under the English flag. He was a pirate. He was an independent operator. But the Spanish openly accused the English crown of not only tolerating Francis Drake, but secretly profiting off of his robberies. And this was probably true. Now, to be clear, there isn't much hard evidence that the English crown was getting a cut of Drake's booty until a little later in the decade. But Elizabeth was certainly tolerating and even encouraging Drake's piracy. But by far the most provocative move came in 1580, when Francis Drake triumphantly returned to England after having commanded the second known voyage to successfully circumnavigate the globe. But that voyage had basically been a trans-Pacific getaway run after Drake had robbed a particularly well-stocked Spanish treasure ship off the coast of Peru. Drake was knighted for his efforts, becoming Sir Francis Drake, and was richly rewarded by Queen Elizabeth. Now, believe it or not, there was some attempt to keep this whole thing secret, but there was no hiding the fact that Drake was now a knight of the realm and was being shown explicit favor by the Queen of England. In 1581, Drake even became a member of Parliament and then the mayor of the town of Plymouth. From the Spanish perspective, this was outrageous. To them, Drake was basically a terrorist. By legitimizing him, the English were essentially rubber stamping his piracy. His robberies could now be interpreted as acts of war. And so it was that England and Spain entered a type of Cold War, with both sides using proxies to get at one another. If the English crown was going to secretly enrich itself by giving a wink to pirates plundering the Spanish Main, then the Spanish crown was going to whip up Catholic dissent in places like Ireland. In 1580, Phillip quietly sent money, weaponry, and supplies to Ireland to aid an ultimately failed Irish Catholic uprising against English rule. On the other side, Queen Elizabeth became more deeply involved in the struggle of the Dutch Protestants rebelling against Habsburg rule. This started secretly, with the English quietly funneling money and resources to the Dutch rebels. When opportunities presented themselves, the English also found ways to disrupt Spanish shipping. Like in 1568, when a group of Spanish ships filled with gold earmarked to pay the Habsburg army fighting in the Low Countries was stopped in an English port. The English authorities found a pretext to keep both the ships and the money. But despite all this provocation, the two kingdoms remained officially at peace. Queen Elizabeth wasn't really a warmonger. In fact, she presented her reign as an era of peace and prosperity for the English. She wasn't really interested in war with the Spanish, but she had a fairly aggressive Protestant faction whose support she depended on. And that faction wanted to stick it to the Catholic Spanish at every opportunity. Elizabeth also couldn't say no to the riches being plundered on the Spanish Main. She also liked the idea of checking Spanish power and influence. So she allowed England to embrace a provocative foreign policy that crept up to the line of what the Spanish would tolerate, without hopefully stepping over it. Philip II also does not seem to have been hankering for a war with England. Frankly, he had enough problems. Specifically, he was most interested in winning the war against the Dutch rebels. By 1588, the conflict in the Netherlands had been raging for nearly 20 years. This had proved to be a bloody and expensive war. In his attempt to regain control of the territory that had been seized by the insurgent Dutch, Philip had been sustaining a huge army known as the Army of Flanders. Now, at the time, the Army of Flanders was one of the largest forces deployed in Europe. Now, despite the fact that this army managed to score some notable victories, the logistics involved with keeping this massive force in the field and paid on time were incredibly challenging. The longer the revolt dragged on, the more Spanish blood and treasure were spent. The idea of a war with England while the war in the Netherlands was still raging did not seem very desirable. That was until the King of Spain became convinced that the only way to end the war in the Netherlands was to get the English out of the way. You see, in 1585, while the Army of Flanders laid siege to the strategically important city of Antwerp in what is today Belgium, Queen Elizabeth made a choice to emerge from the shadows in this conflict. At the Palace of Nonsuch in England, she met with a group of Dutch rebels who represented the, at this point, embryonic government of what would eventually be the Dutch Republic. The treaty they signed, known as the Treaty of Nonsuch, pledged 600,000 florins yearly from the English. That was about a quarter of the yearly cost of the rebellion. On top of that, the English were going to put boots on the ground in the Netherlands to the tune of 6,400 foot soldiers and 1,000 cavalry. In exchange, the Dutch would hand the cities of Brill and Flushing over to the English, and Queen Elizabeth would get to appoint 2 counselors to the newly formed Council of State of the United Provinces in the New Netherlands. In other words, the English were carving out a little piece of the Low Countries for themselves, and Queen Elizabeth was making sure that she had some real influence in any future Dutch state. This was a provocative move. As far as Philip II was concerned, the Treaty of Nonsuch was a declaration of war against Spain. The English were sending troops to the Netherlands and were planning on occupying cities that had long been considered Habsburg domains. From that perspective, it's easy to argue that the English were the original invaders in the Anglo-Spanish War. While there was no formal declaration of war, after Nonsuch, England and Spain were at war, and Philip II started actively making plans for an invasion of the British Isles. Now, an invasion plan does suggest conquest, but what truly were the Spanish war aims here? Well, once again, I've been persuaded by the analysis of historian Phillip Fernandez Armesto, who's argued that the Spanish war aims were far less expansive than they're sometimes presented as. In a nutshell, the plan for the Spanish Armada was for this massive group of ships to sail to modern Belgium, pick up a sizable chunk of the Army of Flanders, ferry them across the Channel, land them in England, then roll over any English resistance on a march to London. This was a fairly audacious plan that didn't have too many precedents. An amphibious assault on England using state-of-the-art transport ships. Honestly, it is quite something. But the very nature of this plan suggests that the army wasn't planning on staying in England very long. The Army of Flanders would eventually be needed back in Flanders. The Spanish were not really gearing up for a long occupation of England, let alone the years of violent oppression that would be required to snuff out Protestant religion in the country. That was a long, bloody, and expensive project, which Philip understood perfectly, considering what was happening in the Netherlands. It's even unlikely that Philip II was looking to orchestrate a regime change in England. It's often been guessed that Philip II would have deposed Queen Elizabeth if the Armada had been successful. But to be honest, there isn't much evidence of that. Pulling off a coup is famously tricky. You need to have a new king or queen waiting in the wings that will be supported by at least some part of the local population. Philip would have likely wanted a Catholic monarch to be on the throne, but there wasn't an obvious choice close at hand. For a long time, the main Catholic hopeful for the throne of England was Elizabeth's cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots. But she was executed in 1587, a solid year before the Armada put to sea. As far as we can tell, Philip was not grooming anyone else for that position. So, the hope probably was that the Armada would barge into the Channel with overwhelming force. The best army in Europe would then be landed in England, London would be seized quickly, and Elizabeth would be forced to sign a humiliating treaty. Fernandez Armesto argues that Philip II's, quote, objectives remained limited, end quote. In his research, he also unearthed instructions given to the Spanish commanders from the King of Spain that make this fairly clear. Fernandez Armesto explains that the Spanish king outlined what he saw as, quote, the minimum acceptable return on his investment, English withdrawal from the Low Countries, peace in the Spanish Main, and a toleration for Catholic worship in England. That was as much as he expected to achieve, and perhaps no more or less than he seriously hoped, end quote. Even in that speech from the Duke of Medina Sidonia that I quoted from earlier, that's so full of religious rhetoric, ends with him making it fairly clear that this mission is about, quote, the prestige of the king, the preservation of the bullion fleets, and the hope that the, quote, war in Flanders will be ended, end quote. He also promises the Spanish soldiers some great opportunities to loot the hell out of English town and country. The fact that this was supposed to be a relatively short mission was certainly understood by the Spanish troops. Fernandez Armesto has pointed to one very telling letter from a Spanish soldier that survived. Quote, his only fear was that the English would surrender quickly and keep the spoils that he craved, end quote. That soldier was worried that the whole thing would be over before he could get some good looting done. So, if we're trying to get a sense of just how big a deal the Spanish Armada was, this should help us calibrate our understanding. If the Armada had been successful, England would not have been incorporated into the Spanish Empire. Queen Elizabeth would have probably remained the Queen of England. English Protestantism would not have been trampled under the Spanish boot. But it would have meant an end to the English support of the Dutch, an end to English piracy in the Caribbean, and guaranteed protections for Catholics in England. It's also likely that the Spanish would have demanded some indemnity payments from the English crown. This would have been bad for England, but not as apocalyptic as it's sometimes framed. This whole thing really was about the Dutch and getting the army of Flanders back to the Low Countries so the Habsburgs could win that war. But of course, the Spanish Armada was not successful. The question is why? Well, that's a story for next time. Okay, that's all for this week. Join us again in 2 weeks' time when we will wrap up this series on the Spanish Armada. Just a reminder, if you want to hear your voice on the upcoming 200th episode of Our Fake History, send me a voice memo at ourfakehistory@gmail.com or call the 1-800 number, 1-800-397-0870. I've been getting tons of messages, so I probably won't be able to use them all. If I don't use your call, it's not because I don't love you. It's just because I've gotten so many and I've got to be choosy. Before we go this week, as always, I need to give a shout out to some very amazing people. Big ups to Sky Safira, to Stephen Keckler, to Papa J, to Human's Word, to Loris van Ryn, speaking of the Dutch, I hope I said that correctly, to Tammy Calhoun, to Hugh Huynh, to Wesley Song, to Shannon 2000T, to Lloyd Case, to Scott J. Susan, to Cecilia M., to Brianna Cluck, to Heinrich Schliemann, to Calvin Kingston, and to Grant Scherer. All of these people have decided to pledge $5 or more every month on Patreon. So you know what that means. They are beautiful human beings. Thank you, thank you, thank you for your support. Thank you to everyone who supports the podcast at all levels. Thank you to everyone that does that free stuff that supports the show, like telling people about the podcast or writing nice 5-star reviews wherever you can do it. If you ever want to get in touch with me, feel free to send me an email at ourfakehistory@gmail.com. Hit me up on Facebook, facebook.com/ourfakehistory. Find me on Twitter at ourfakehistory. Find me on Instagram at ourfakehistory. Find me on TikTok at ourfakehistory. And go to the YouTube channel. Just go to YouTube and search for Our Fake History and check out the videos I'm putting up there. As always, the theme music for the show comes to us from Dirty Church. You can check out more from Dirty Church at dirtychurch.bandcamp.com. And all the other music you heard on the show today was written and recorded by me. My name is Sebastian Major, and remember, just because it didn't happen doesn't mean it isn't real.